A lush Hawaiian peninsula hides a terrible secret. This is the story of the Kalaupapa leper colony, a place where paradise became a prison for over a century. You will understand the full, heartbreaking saga of the thousands exiled there, and the incredible community they built against all odds. How did a remote shore become a dumping ground for the sick? And what happens when the people sent to die choose to live? By the end, you will know the truth behind one of history's most tragic experiments in isolation. What does it mean to be separated from the world, not by walls, but by fear? The story begins not with a disease, but with a collision of worlds. In the early 1800s, foreign ships brought more than trade goods to the Hawaiian Islands. They brought a microscopic stowaway, a bacterium known today as Hansen's disease, to the native Hawaiian people who had no history of this illness. It was a terrifying and unknown affliction. They called it Maiho Kawel, the separating sickness, a name that would prove tragically prophetic. The visible symptoms, skin lesions and nerve damage, sparked a deep cultural panic. With no understanding of how it spread, fear festered. The sick were seen not as patients, but as a threat to the very survival of the kingdom. This fear crystallized into law in 1865. Under King Kamehameha V, the Hawaiian legislature passed the act to prevent the spread of leprosy. It was a document of profound dread, granting the government absolute power. Any person, upon the suspicion of a doctor or even a community leader, could be arrested. There was no trial, no appeal. A simple medical examination, often rushed and crude, was enough to sign a one-way ticket to exile. The law did not speak of treatment or cure. It spoke only of removal. The goal was not to heal, but to make the sick disappear from sight, to quarantine an entire population out of existence. But where do you send people you never wished to see again? The authorities needed a place so isolated, so formidable, that escape would be unthinkable. They found it on the northern coast of Molokai. The Kalaupapa Peninsula is a flat, green shelf of land bounded on three sides by the raging Pacific Ocean, and on the fourth by the tallest sea cliffs in the world, rising 2,000 feet straight up. It was a natural prison, perfect in its cruelty. The only access was a treacherous footpath down the cliff face, or by a dangerous boat landing through pounding surf. To the government, it was the ideal solution. To those sentenced to go there, it was the end of the world. On a January morning in 1866, the first group of exiles learned their fate. They were 12 men and women, pulled from their homes and families, forced onto a ship. They endured a journey across rough channels, staring at the receding shoreline of everything they had ever known. When they arrived at Kalaupapa, they were met with nothing. No buildings, no prepared shelters, no stores of food or medicine. The government had provided a destination, but not a settlement. They were simply dumped on the shore with minimal supplies and left to fend for themselves. Imagine that moment, the ship sailing away, the crushing silence broken only by wind and wave, the sheer, insurmountable cliffs at your back. You are sick, you are terrified, and you have been officially, permanently abandoned by your own kingdom. This was not a colony's founding. It was a sentence to die in a beautiful, lonely cage. And yet, this bleak and desolate shore was about to become home. The first residents of Kalaupapa faced a simple, brutal equation. They were sick, they were abandoned, and survival was not guaranteed. Their new home was a windswept peninsula where the soil was poor and the ocean's bounty was often out of reach beyond the dangerous surf. Shelter was whatever they could cobble together from driftwood, pilly grass, and the few supplies left behind. Crude huts offered little protection from the relentless rain and wind. Hunger was a constant companion, as the unreliable supply ships from Honolulu were the only source of food, medicine, and basic tools. When the ships were delayed by storms or bureaucratic neglect, The colony teetered on the edge of starvation. Disease did not pause for their suffering. Without effective treatment, Hansen's disease progressed, leading to numbness, wounds, and disabilities. In this place, a simple cut could become a life-threatening infection. To manage this desperate situation, the government appointed superintendents, often former patients themselves, who were tasked with distributing rations and maintaining a fragile order with almost no resources. It was a system built on scarcity, where the primary goal was containment, not care. Yet, within this landscape of profound injustice, something extraordinary began to happen. The people sent here to be forgotten began to remember who they were. They were not just patients. They were fathers, mothers, musicians, farmers, and storytellers. They became Kamoena, people of the land, and they built a society. With their own hands, they constructed churches, painting them in bright colors that defied the gray cliffs. They formed a band whose music echoed against the pali, a defiant sound of joy. They started schools for the children who were born there or arrived with their parents. The heart of this community, however, was found in a profound act of love, the kokua. These were family members, usually spouses or parents, who voluntarily chose to accompany their loved ones into exile. They made this choice knowing the terrible rule. Once they set foot on Kalaupapa, they could never leave. They surrendered their own freedom, their own futures, to provide care, comfort, and a piece of home. A kokua might be the only hands gentle enough to dress a wound, or the only voice familiar enough to soothe a lonely heart. They were the unwavering proof that even in a place designed for separation, human connection could not be outlawed. So, while the government saw a colony of lepers, the people of Kalaupapa were building a home. They celebrated birthdays and holidays. They fell in love and married. They grieved their losses together. They created a shared identity, forged not from the disease that brought them there, but from the resilience they discovered in each other. This fragile community, however, existed in a vacuum of medical care. Their physical suffering was immense, and their spiritual needs were even greater. They were a people in profound need of a miracle, or at the very least, a moment of genuine compassion. That moment would arrive not with a change in policy, but with the arrival of a single, unlikely man. Into this world of profound need stepped a man whose name would become inseparable from Kalaupapa itself. He was a young Belgian priest named Father Damien, born Joseph de Veuster. In 1873, he volunteered for a 4-month rotation to serve the spiritual needs of the colony. But upon arriving and seeing the sheer scale of the suffering, he made a radical decision. He would not leave. He requested permission to stay permanently, writing to his superiors that he was a prisoner of the lepers, and he would remain one for life. This was not a symbolic gesture. Damien moved into a small shack, ate from the same communal pot, dressed ulcers with his own hands, and built coffins so the dead could be buried with dignity instead of being wrapped in blankets and thrown into shallow graves. He was a whirlwind of activity, constructing homes, a church, a water system, and tirelessly petitioning the government and the outside world for supplies, medicine, and basic human consideration. He gave the people something they had been systematically denied, a sense of worth. He called them his children, and he treated them not as contagious outcasts, but as a flock to be cherished. Yet, Father Damien was a complex and controversial figure, not a simple saint from a storybook. Historical accounts from some residents and contemporary observers describe him as stubborn, authoritarian, and fiercely protective of his authority over the colony's affairs. He clashed with government officials and even with some of the patients who resisted his strict moral codes. His methods were born of a desperate urgency, not a gentle bedside manner. The ultimate testament to his commitment, however, was written on his own body. After 11 years of intimate, unprotected contact, he contracted Hansen's disease. He famously began a sermon with the words, "We lepers," fully identifying with the people he served. He died at Kalaupapa in 1889 at the age of 49. His canonization as a saint by the Catholic Church in 2009 reignited debate. For many, it was a long overdue recognition of heroic sacrifice. For others, particularly some native Hawaiians, it symbolized the problematic narrative of the white savior, overshadowing the resilience of the patients themselves and the vital care later provided by native Hawaiian caregivers and nuns. That vital care was epitomized by Mother Marianne, a Franciscan nun from New York. She arrived with a small group of sisters in 1888, just before Damien's death. Where Damien was a fiery builder, Mother Marianne was a steady, skilled administrator. She took charge of the home for girls and women, instituting standards of cleanliness and compassionate care that dramatically improved health outcomes. Critically, she and her sisters never contracted the disease, which they attributed to their strict hygiene and perhaps to a different kind of grace. Her leadership provided stability and expert nursing for decades, a quiet, enduring counterpart to Damien's brief, blazing storm. The story of Kalaupapa is also marked by figures of power who looked upon the colony from the outside. Hawaiian royalty, most notably Queen Liliuokalani, made the difficult journey to visit before her overthrow. She witnessed the conditions firsthand and became a powerful advocate, using her position to demand better food, shelter, and medical attention from the government. Her visits were moments of profound significance, a reminder to the exiles that they were still remembered by their sovereign. The government-appointed superintendents, however, presented a mixed legacy. Some were kind and dedicated, working within a broken system to ease suffering. Others were neglectful or corrupt, hoarding supplies or ruling with a cruel indifference that amplified the colony's hardships. This gallery of characters, from the self-sacrificing priest and the pragmatic nun to the advocating queen and the flawed bureaucrats, reveals a fundamental truth. The history of Kalaupapa cannot be told as a simple parable of good versus evil. It is a human tapestry, woven with threads of extraordinary compassion, complicated motives, systemic failure, and the persistent, quiet strength of a community watching it all unfold from the shore. Their exile, however, was entering its darkest chapter, a period defined not by a lack of care, but by a terrifying new form of control. The promise of a cure was a ghost that haunted Kalaupapa for generations. For decades, the only medical hope offered was chalmugra oil, a thick, bitter treatment extracted from the seeds of a tropical tree. Patients drank it, injected it, or rubbed it into their skin, enduring its awful taste and painful side effects for results that were, at best, inconsistent. It was a symbol of how little the outside world understood or prioritized their disease. The real turning point arrived silently, not with a dramatic announcement, but with a quiet scientific revolution during the Second World War. In the 1940s, a powerful new antibiotic called dapsone was developed. For the first time, a medication could actually arrest the progression of Hansen's disease, making it non-contagious within just a few doses. This was the key that could finally unlock the prison. By the 1960s, even more effective multi-drug therapies emerged, rendering the disease completely treatable on an outpatient basis. The very foundation of Kalaupapa's existence, the idea that isolation was medically necessary, had crumbled to dust, yet laws and fears are often slower to change than medical science. While patients inside Kalaupapa began receiving these new treatments, the world outside still saw them through a lens of ancient stigma. The barbed wire was now in the mind. A powerful movement for patient rights began to grow, led by courageous residents and their allies who demanded the repeal of the archaic isolation laws. They argued a simple, undeniable truth. If the disease was no longer contagious, then their exile was no longer a quarantine. It was a human rights violation. Their persistence finally broke through. In 1969, 104 years after the first exile ship landed, the Hawaiian legislature repealed the mandatory isolation laws. The prison gates were officially opened, but freedom, when it finally came, was a complicated gift. Imagine being told you are free to leave a place that has been your entire world for 30, 40, or 50 years. Your family on the outside may have passed away or moved on. The Hawaii you remember no longer exists. You have no job, no home, and you still carry the social stain of the disease. For many of the remaining residents, the most liberating choice was to exercise their right to stay. The state established a right of return policy, guaranteeing that any patient who wished to could live out their lives at Kalaupapa with full support and services. The place designed as their tomb had become their sanctuary. So, the exile ended, but the community endured. The population, however, was aging and not being replaced. With no new patients sent there, Kalaupapa began a slow, quiet transition from an active colony to a living monument. The sounds of construction faded, replaced by a profound and echoing peace. The question now hanging in the salt air was not about survival, but about legacy. What becomes of a place like this when its last guardians are gone? How do you honor a story written in so much pain and resilience? The answer would require looking back not just at the history, but deep into the very soil and stones of the peninsula itself. The story of Kalaupapa is one of profound contradiction, a century-long chapter where humanity's deepest fears clashed with its highest resilience. It was a tragedy born from panic, a policy that sacrificed thousands of lives on the altar of public health. Yet, within that imposed prison, an undeniable spirit took root. People sentenced to die chose instead to build a life, forging bonds of family, faith, and culture against the backdrop of the soaring pali and the endless sea. The legacy is carried by the land itself, now preserved as the Kalaupapa National Historical Park. This is not a museum of artifacts, but a sacred space of memory. Visitors can only come by invitation, often from the remaining patient residents themselves, making each journey a quiet pilgrimage of respect and witness. These few elderly survivors are the last living connections to the isolation era, the final voices who can say, "I was there." Their presence transforms history from a distant fact into a personal, breathing story. As their numbers dwindle, the responsibility to remember passes entirely to us. This history forces us to sit with difficult, unanswered questions. Can we ever truly reconcile the medical understanding of the 1800s with the catastrophic human cost of its policies? Where is the line between necessary quarantine and cruel exile? The descendants of those exiled, and the native Hawaiian community as a whole, still grapple with the intergenerational trauma of that separation. How do we honor their pain while also preserving the site where their ancestors lived, loved, and are buried? Kalaupapa's quiet shore holds a mirror to our own times. It asks what we fear, who we cast out, and what kind of community we choose to build, especially when faced with sickness and uncertainty. It is a permanent reminder that the most isolating walls are often built not from stone, but from stigma. The echoes of those 8,000 souls are a whisper on the wind, a story that refuses to be forgotten. What does their century of isolation teach you about courage, community, and compassion? Share your reflections below and seek out the stories of Kalaupapa. Their history is a poignant, powerful lesson in what it means to be human, left on a remote shore for all of us to discover.